You really think someone like you belongs in this room?" The words cut through the silence with the sharp confidence of a man who had never been questioned a day in his life. The boardroom went still. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade beneath the weight of those 8 words. At the far end of a 40-foot walnut conference table, surrounded by executives in tailored suits worth more than most people's monthly rent, a young black woman stood perfectly motionless. Maya Williams kept both hands folded in front of her, her housekeeping cart parked quietly beside the wall. The silver coffee tray she had been carrying moments earlier rested untouched on a nearby counter. No one expected her to answer. In rooms like this, people like Maya were expected to appear, serve, and disappear. That was the rule. That was always the rule. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a bright October sky. Sunlight bounced off glass towers and painted long streaks of gold across the polished floor. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt colder. Much colder. Richard Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Capital Group, leaned back in his leather chair with the relaxed arrogance of a man accustomed to owning every conversation. At 62 years old, he had built a financial empire large enough to influence governors, senators, and billion-dollar corporations. People listened when he spoke. People obeyed. And most importantly, people rarely challenged him. Especially not a hotel housekeeper. Maya lowered her eyes for a brief moment. Not because she was intimidated, but because she had spent most of her life learning how to survive without drawing attention. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a maintenance worker and a nursing assistant, raised in a 2-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side where every dollar mattered and every opportunity had to be earned twice. Her mother often said that dignity was something nobody could hand you and nobody could take away. Maya carried those words everywhere. Even now, especially now. Around the table, several executives exchanged amused glances. One man smirked openly. Another shook his head as though watching an embarrassing mistake unfold in real time. To them, Maya was simply part of the furniture. The woman who replaced coffee cups. The woman who wiped fingerprints from glass doors after meetings ended. The woman whose name nobody bothered to remember. Richard tapped the contract lying in front of him and smiled without warmth. I asked a question. His voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. Do you honestly believe someone like you belongs here? A nervous chuckle escaped from one side of the table. Then another. The sound spread slowly through the room. Maya could feel every pair of eyes settling on her. Waiting. Judging. Measuring her worth before she had spoken a single word. Yet something unusual happened. She did not shrink. She did not apologize. She did not rush toward the door. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and looked directly at the contract resting beneath Richard Sterling's hand. The same contract she had accidentally noticed while clearing empty coffee cups 20 minutes earlier. The same contract containing one detail that had made her heart stop. One detail nobody else in the room seemed to have noticed. Sunlight glinted against the glass wall behind her. The room remained silent. And for the first time that morning, Maya Williams opened her mouth to speak. For a moment, nobody moved. Maya could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted above the glass doors and the distant sound of traffic 27 floors below. Richard Sterling continued watching her with the detached curiosity of a man observing a problem he had not yet decided whether to remove. Yet Maya's attention remained fixed on the document in front of him. Her heartbeat was steady now. The fear had already passed. Fear was familiar. She had learned long ago that it rarely helped. What mattered was what came after. 12 hours earlier, her world had looked very different. Before sunrise, while most of downtown Chicago still slept beneath pale streetlights and cold autumn air, Maya had been standing at a crowded bus stop, wearing a navy housekeeping uniform beneath a secondhand coat. The wind carried the smell of rain from Lake Michigan as commuters waited silently with paper coffee cups warming their hands. Maya stood near the back of the line, earbuds tucked away in her pocket. She preferred quiet. Quiet gave her room to think. The bus arrived 7 minutes late. Like every morning, she climbed aboard, found a seat near the window, and opened the same worn notebook she carried everywhere. Most people scrolling through social media would have assumed it was a journal. It was not. Every page contained notes. Financial terms, contract language, corporate governance rules, merger structures, risk analysis frameworks. Subjects that had once filled her college classrooms before life interrupted the future she thought she was building. 3 years earlier, Maya had been one semester away from completing a business law degree. Then her father suffered a stroke. Medical bills arrived faster than paychecks. Her mother picked up extra shifts. Maya left school without ceremony and accepted the first full-time job she could find. One semester became 1 year. 1 year became 3. The diploma never came. The debt did. Yet she never stopped learning. At night, after helping her parents and paying bills, she studied. She read annual reports while other people watched television. She borrowed business books from the public library. She listened to lectures during bus rides. Knowledge cost less than tuition. Nobody noticed except her. By 8 o'clock that morning, she had already cleaned 3 executive offices and polished 2 conference rooms. Most executives passed her without making eye contact. Maya did not take it personally. Invisible people often saw things everyone else missed. That was how she noticed the contract. It had been left open on the conference table while assistants prepared for the meeting. Just 1 page visible. Just 1 paragraph exposed beneath a stack of presentation folders. Maya had not intended to read it. In fact, she tried not to. But a phrase caught her eye. Liability transfer provisions. Her training resurfaced instantly. Something about the wording felt wrong. She paused. Read it again. Then a third time. The language appeared ordinary at first glance, hidden beneath layers of legal terminology. Yet beneath those polished sentences sat a risk large enough to destroy a company. The realization had followed her all morning, even while replacing coffee cups, even while wiping fingerprints from glass walls. Now she stood in the boardroom carrying the weight of that discovery. Around the table, executives waited impatiently. Richard Sterling narrowed his eyes. The amusement on several faces slowly faded. Maya took a quiet breath. She knew exactly why she was standing there. And she knew that once she spoke, nothing about this day would remain ordinary. While Maya spent her days moving quietly through hallways lined with polished glass, the man whose company occupied those floors lived in an entirely different world. Jackson Hale was the founder and chief executive of Hale Investments, a financial empire that stretched across real estate, technology, and private equity. At 62 years old, he had built a reputation that inspired equal amounts of admiration and fear. Newspapers called him a visionary. Competitors called him ruthless. Employees simply called him Mr. Hale. Every morning, a black sedan carried him through downtown Charlotte before sunrise. By 7 o'clock, he was already reviewing reports inside a corner office larger than most apartments. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city below, turning the skyline into a private painting framed by steel and glass. Success surrounded him everywhere. Awards filled shelves. Magazine covers lined a wall near his desk. Yet none of those achievements softened the sharp edges of his personality. Jackson trusted numbers more than people. He believed weakness created failure and emotions clouded judgment. Those beliefs had helped him build a billion-dollar company, but they had also created distance between him and nearly everyone around him. Even his wife, Clara Hale, had learned to navigate conversations carefully. Elegant, intelligent, and highly respected in Charlotte society, Clara understood that her husband rarely changed his mind once a decision had been made. On the morning before the merger meeting, Jackson stood at the head of a conference table reviewing documents that could reshape the future of his company. The proposed merger with Vaughn Global represented one of the largest deals in Hale Investments history. If successful, it would expand the firm's influence nationwide. If it failed, the consequences could be devastating. Around the table sat attorneys, consultants, analysts, and executives. Each person carried years of experience and impressive credentials. Yet despite the room being filled with experts, one voice dominated every discussion. Jackson's. When someone offered an opinion, he evaluated it immediately. If he agreed, the conversation moved forward. If he disagreed, the subject ended. Few people challenged him directly. Fewer still succeeded when they did. Across town, Derek Vaughn prepared for the same meeting with a very different energy. Younger, charismatic, and known for his polished public image, he had mastered the art of making people comfortable while quietly advancing his own interests. His smile appeared effortless. His confidence seemed natural. Yet beneath that charm was a businessman every bit as ambitious as Jackson Hale. The merger promised enormous rewards for both companies. At least on paper. By late afternoon, anticipation filled the executive floors. Assistants moved quickly between offices. Attorneys reviewed final drafts. Coffee cups accumulated beside laptops and legal binders. Everyone understood the importance of the next day's meeting. Millions of dollars depended on the signatures that would soon appear at the bottom of a contract. As the sun began to set beyond the Charlotte skyline, golden lights stretched across the marble floors of Hale Investments. Employees packed their bags and headed home. Executives finalized presentations. Security guards started evening rounds. And somewhere on the 27th floor, a quiet 16-year-old girl continued cleaning conference rooms, completely unaware that within hours she would find herself standing between two powerful men and a decision that could change all of their lives. 3 floors below the executive boardroom, Maya Williams pushed a maintenance cart through a quiet corridor lined with glass offices and framed photographs of corporate milestones. The wheels rolled softly across the polished floor. In one hand, she carried a spray bottle. In the other, a folded microfiber cloth already worn from hours of work. Most employees barely noticed her. A few nodded politely. Others walked past without looking up from their phones. Maya did not take it personally. She had learned long ago that people often saw uniforms before they saw human beings. The morning sunlight poured through the eastern windows, painting bright rectangles across the marble floor. As she cleaned fingerprints from a conference room door, her eyes drifted toward a stack of documents left on a nearby table. Normally, she ignored paperwork. It was not her business. It was not her job. But one page had slipped partially free from a binder, revealing a section highlighted in yellow. The heading caught her attention immediately. Merger liability allocation. Maya paused. Something felt familiar. During countless evenings at the public library, she had read books on finance, corporate law, and business history. Years earlier, before medical bills forced her family into survival mode, she had dreamed of studying economics full-time. That dream had been postponed, but the knowledge had never left her. She looked around the empty room. No one was there. Her eyes returned to the document. One sentence stood out, then another. Her stomach tightened. The language was complicated, wrapped inside layers of legal terminology, but the meaning beneath it felt alarmingly clear. The responsibility for future claims appeared to fall almost entirely on Hale Capital. If problems emerged after the merger, one company would carry the risk while the other escaped most consequences. Maya blinked and reread the paragraph. Then she read it again. The more she studied it, the more uneasy she became. Footsteps echoed somewhere down the hallway. She immediately stepped back and resumed cleaning. Her pulse remained elevated. Minutes later, she entered another office, but the words refused to leave her mind. By lunchtime, she had replayed the clause dozens of times. Maybe she misunderstood it. Maybe a team of lawyers had already reviewed everything. Maybe it was none of her business. Yet a deeper voice continued whispering the same question. What if everyone missed it? Late that afternoon, Maya wheeled her cart past the executive floor. The large conference room doors stood slightly open. Voices flowed into the hallway. Executives were gathered around the long table. Financial projections filled massive screens mounted on the walls. At the head of the room sat Jackson Hale. Confident, focused, seconds away from final approval. Maya slowed her pace. Her heart began pounding. Every instinct told her to keep walking. She was a maintenance worker. They were corporate leaders. People like her did not interrupt meetings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She tightened her grip on the cart handle and continued past the doorway. One step, then another. Then she stopped completely. The silence inside the room shifted. A contract was being passed toward Jackson. A pen appeared in his hand. Maya felt a sudden knot in her chest. If she stayed quiet and the agreement was safe, nothing would happen. But if she stayed quiet and the clause meant what she believed it meant, the consequences could be enormous. She took a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly. Then, before fear could stop her, Maya turned toward the open doorway and stepped inside. The reaction came instantly. A sharp laugh broke the silence near the far end of the table. Then another. Several executives exchanged amused looks, while others stared at Maya as though she had crossed an invisible line that should never have been crossed. Derek Vaughn folded his hands calmly and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind reserved for people he believed did not belong in the conversation. "I apologize," he said smoothly, turning toward Jackson Hale, But are we really pausing a billion-dollar acquisition because of an observation from a teenager who organizes maintenance paperwork? A few people chuckled quietly. Maya felt heat rise into her cheeks. The folders in her hands suddenly felt heavier. Around the room, eyes shifted away from the spreadsheet and settled entirely on her. The discussion was no longer about numbers. It was about status. Jackson remained silent. His expression revealed nothing. One executive adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. "Miss Williams, do you have any formal financial credentials?" Maya hesitated. "No, sir." Another executive immediately leaned back in his chair. "Then perhaps this analysis should be left to professionals." The words landed harder than they sounded. Not because they were cruel, but because they reflected exactly how the room saw her. A maintenance worker's daughter. A visitor. Someone who should remain invisible. Derek nodded slightly, sensing the shift in momentum. "Exactly. We cannot allow every person who wanders into a boardroom to challenge months of work prepared by highly compensated experts." Several people murmured in agreement. Maya's throat tightened. She knew she should stop speaking. Every instinct told her to step back and disappear. Yet the numbers on the screen remained unchanged. The mistake was still there. The risk was still real. She took a slow breath. "Sir, I understand how this looks," she said quietly. "But if the updated assessment from March is applied instead of the January model, projected liability exposure increases by almost 18%. The room froze again. Not because they believed her. Because they were shocked she continued speaking. Derek's smile vanished. One of the analysts quickly opened a laptop. Another frowned and began scrolling through internal files. Jackson's gaze narrowed slightly. "Where did you get that figure?" Maya answered immediately. "Appendix C of the revised compliance report. Page 47. The analyst stopped typing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He found the file. The room became strangely still. No one laughed now. The analyst's eyes moved across the screen. His expression changed. Another analyst leaned over to look. Then another. A quiet whisper spread between them. Derek shifted in his chair for the first time all afternoon. "That document is preliminary," he said quickly. "It was never intended to be used for valuation purposes." But nobody responded to him. The analysts continued reading. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. Then one of them looked up toward Jackson. His face had gone pale. "Sir, the revised report does show a significantly higher exposure level." Jackson slowly turned toward the projection screen. No one spoke. Outside the windows, the evening sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished table. Maya stood alone near the wall, surrounded by expensive suits and powerful titles, yet somehow feeling smaller than ever. She had spoken the truth, and instead of earning respect, she had become the target of an entire room's disbelief. The humiliation lingered in the air like a weight no one could ignore. Even so, Maya remained standing. Her shoulders were tense. Her heart was racing, but she refused to lower her eyes. Because losing the room was easier than losing her integrity. The elevators hummed softly as employees moved through the building, but the tension that had gripped the upper floors all afternoon had slowly transformed into something quieter. The rush of arguments, legal reviews, and urgent phone calls had faded behind closed doors. Maya Williams sat alone near a large window overlooking the city. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the skyline, washing the glass towers outside in shades of gold and amber. Her visitor badge rested loosely against her chest. For the first time since stepping into the conference room, there was nothing left for her to do. No one was questioning her. No one was asking her to explain herself. She simply waited. Beside her, Denise stared out at the same view. The silence between mother and daughter felt heavy, but no longer sharp. After several minutes, Denise finally spoke. Her voice was softer than before. "You really believed you were right?" Maya nodded. "Yes, Mom." Denise looked down at her hands. Years of cleaning chemicals had roughened her skin. Years of long shifts had bent her shoulders. She had spent most of her life surviving consequences created by people with more power than she would ever have. That reality had taught caution. It had taught silence. Yet sitting beside her daughter now, she saw something she had not fully understood before. Maya had inherited none of that fear. "I was scared for you," Denise admitted quietly. Maya smiled faintly. "I know." The sunlight drifted across the polished floor. Dust particles floated through the golden beams like tiny stars suspended in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang and then stopped. The building seemed calmer than it had all day. Maya leaned back against her chair and exhaled slowly. She thought about her grandfather. Years earlier, he used to sit with her at a small kitchen table covered with newspapers and business magazines rescued from library donation bins. Most children spend afternoons watching cartoons. Maya spent hers listening to stories about corporate collapses, hidden risks, and ordinary people who noticed details everyone else ignored. Her grandfather often said that truth rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time, it whispers. People simply fail to listen. The memory brought warmth to her chest. Outside, the city lights gradually flickered on one by one as daylight faded. Traffic moved along the streets below like streams of red and white ribbons. The world continued forward, unaware of how close a single decision had come to changing dozens of lives. Maya closed her eyes briefly. Whatever happened next, she knew she had acted according to her conscience. That mattered more than any job title, more than any executive office, more than the opinions of strangers. Across the building, behind walls of glass and steel, attorneys were still reviewing documents. Executives were still making calls. Numbers were still being analyzed. Yet none of those things occupied Maya's mind anymore. She simply watched the sunset. The warmth of the fading light touched her face as if the day itself were offering quiet reassurance. Sometimes courage did not feel triumphant. Sometimes it felt like sitting in silence after everyone else had finished arguing. Sometimes it felt like uncertainty wrapped in peace. And as darkness slowly settled across the skyline, Maya remained by the window, calm and steady, unaware that several floors above her, a discovery was about to change everything. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city wrapped in a pale silver light that softened the sharp edges of glass towers and concrete streets. Inside the executive conference room, the atmosphere felt different. No one spoke above a whisper. No one checked a phone. The confidence that had filled the room the day before had been replaced by something quieter and far more uncomfortable. Jackson Hale stood at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the stack of documents spread before him. Overnight, 3 separate legal teams had reviewed every page of the merger agreement. They had checked the numbers twice. Then a third time. The conclusion had been unanimous. Maya Williams had been right. Not partially right. Not accidentally right. Completely right. The liability clause she had pointed out would have exposed Hale Investments to losses large enough to cripple the company within months. One signature. That was all it would have taken. One careless stroke of a pen. Across the table, senior executives shifted uneasily in their seats. Several avoided eye contact altogether. They remembered the way they had looked at her. The borrowed sneakers. The janitor badge. The assumptions. Jackson slowly closed the report. The sound echoed through the room. Nobody moved. Nobody had an argument left to offer. For the first time in years, the most powerful people in the building were forced to confront a truth they could not negotiate away. Intelligence did not arrive wearing expensive suits. Wisdom did not ask permission before entering a room. And integrity certainly did not care about job titles. Downstairs, unaware of the conversation unfolding above her, Maya sat beside her mother in the employee cafeteria. The fluorescent lights reflected softly against the polished floor. A paper cup of coffee rested between her hands, long since gone cold. She expected bad news. Maybe termination. Maybe a formal warning. Maybe nothing at all. She had spent the entire night replaying the moment in her head, wondering if speaking up had been worth it. Then the cafeteria doors opened. The room gradually fell silent. Employees turned their heads. Jackson Hale entered without his usual entourage. Without assistance. Without security. He walked directly across the room. Every footstep seemed louder than the last. Maya looked up, confused. Her mother stiffened beside her. Jackson stopped in front of their table. For a brief moment, nobody breathed. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Not above her. Not over her. Across from her. His expression was calm, but the weight behind his eyes revealed a sleepless night. He placed a thick folder on the table. The same contract, covered now with notes, corrections, and legal flags. "You saved this company," he said quietly. The words settled over the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Just silence. Honest silence. Because everyone present understood the significance of what had happened. The girl they had overlooked had seen what none of them had seen. And in that moment, Jackson finally understood that the most valuable voice in the building had nearly been escorted out the door. The following afternoon, the atmosphere inside Hale Investments felt nothing like it had a day earlier. Conversations were quieter. Footsteps seemed slower across the polished marble floors. The confidence that usually filled the executive wing had been replaced by something rarer and far more uncomfortable: reflection. Maya Williams sat in a modest conference room overlooking the city skyline, her hands resting calmly on the table. She had not come expecting recognition. She had not come seeking revenge. In truth, she would have been satisfied simply knowing that a disastrous mistake had been avoided. The door opened, and Jackson Hale stepped inside alone. No attorneys, no assistants, no board members. Just the man who had nearly signed away his company and the young woman he had failed to understand. For a moment, neither spoke. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the table between them. Jackson looked older than he had the day before. Not weaker, simply more honest. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. His eyes remained on the folder in front of him before finally lifting to meet hers. "I spent most of last night reviewing every page," he said quietly. "You were right." Maya nodded once, but said nothing. Jackson exhaled slowly. "My legal team confirmed everything. If that agreement had been signed, thousands of employees would have paid the price for my mistake." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was thoughtful, heavy with truths neither could ignore. "I judged you before I listened," Jackson continued. "I saw a janitor's daughter and assumed that was the most important thing about you." Maya lowered her gaze briefly. She had heard variations of that lesson her entire life. "A lot of people do," she replied gently. Jackson looked toward the window for several seconds. The city beyond seemed smaller somehow. That does not make it right. He reached into the folder and carefully slid several documents across the table. Maya glanced down. Scholarship applications, internship offers, academic recommendations, opportunities that most students spent years chasing. "These are not gifts," Jackson said. "They are doors. Doors that should have been open long ago." Maya studied the papers, then looked back at him. "You do not owe me anything, sir." A faint smile touched Jackson's face, though it carried more humility than pride. "Maybe not, but I owe the truth something." Another quiet moment settled between them. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the bright afternoon sky. "You could have stayed silent," Jackson said. "You could have watched me fail and walked away." Maya thought about the question, thought about her mother polishing floors, thought about the countless times people had dismissed her voice before hearing it. "If I had stayed silent," she answered softly, "I would have become part of the problem." Jackson nodded. The answer seemed to affect him more than any accusation could have. He stood slowly and extended his hand across the table. Not as a billionaire, not as a chief executive, simply as a man admitting he had been wrong. Maya rose and shook it. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of something much larger than business. Respect, understanding, growth. When they released their grip, neither person had won nor lost. Something better had happened. One person had chosen courage. The other had chosen humility. And in the quiet sunlight filling that room, both choices mattered. 3 months later, the first light of a cool Saturday morning spilled across downtown Charlotte, painting the glass towers in soft shades of gold. The city was waking slowly. Coffee shops unlocked their doors. Delivery trucks rolled through quiet intersections. High above the streets, on the 27th floor of Hale Investments, a familiar conference room stood filled with calm conversation instead of tension. Maya Williams paused outside the glass doors, adjusting the strap of her bag. The reflection staring back at her looked different now. Not because of the professional clothes she wore or the identification badge clipped neatly to her jacket. The difference lived somewhere deeper. Confidence had quietly settled where uncertainty once stood. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Several executives greeted her with warm smiles. No one looked past her anymore. No one asked why she was there. They already knew. At the far end of the room, Jackson Hale stood beside a presentation screen, reviewing notes. When he noticed her, he smiled and gave a small nod. It was the same room where her voice had once been dismissed. The same room where security had been called. Yet somehow it felt entirely different. Respect had changed the atmosphere more than money ever could. Maya took her seat near the center of the table. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun stretched across the skyline like a promise. A few minutes later, the meeting began. Ideas moved around the room. Questions were asked. Solutions were debated. And when Maya spoke, people listened. Not because she was special. Not because someone powerful had approved of her. They listened because she had earned their trust through integrity and courage. Outside the building, Denise Williams stepped from a city bus carrying a small paper bag with breakfast inside. She had finished her night shift at another office complex and was heading home. As she crossed the street, she glanced up toward the shining tower where her daughter now worked. For several seconds, she simply stood there. The wind tugged gently at her jacket. Pride filled her eyes. Not because Maya had entered the corporate world, not because opportunity had finally arrived, but because her daughter had stayed true to herself through every obstacle. She had never allowed bitterness to replace kindness. Denise smiled quietly and continued walking. Back upstairs, the meeting ended just before noon. Employees filtered into the hallway. Conversations blended with distant elevator chimes. Maya lingered near the windows after everyone left. Below, traffic flowed through the city like a steady river of motion and purpose. Jackson approached and stopped beside her. Neither spoke immediately. There was no need. Sometimes the most important truths required no words at all. Finally, he looked out across the skyline and said softly, "You changed more than a contract." Maya smiled. "Maybe we all changed a little." Jackson nodded. The answer felt right. The room grew quiet again. Sunlight reflected from neighboring buildings, scattering bright patterns across the polished floor. Somewhere below, a siren echoed briefly before fading into the distance. Life continued moving forward. Maya rested her hand lightly against the cool glass and watched the city breathe beneath her. Months earlier, she had entered this building through a service entrance beside her mother. Today she stood here because she had chosen honesty when silence would have been easier. The lesson was simple. Character did not come from status. Wisdom did not belong to titles. And dignity could never be measured by a paycheck. Outside, a gentle breeze moved between the towers. Inside, sunlight warmed the room. Maya stood quietly, looking toward the horizon. No applause followed. No dramatic announcement arrived. Only a peaceful silence remained. And in that silence, justice felt complete.